It's not as much as you might think because it requires you have a capital account, which makes it more difficult to regulate your own financial system. You have a lot of hot money going both ways. But it does mean that there is a stability injected into your system, and that stability allows you a lot more ballast. So a great example is what happened during the Nixon period when we decided to go off the gold standard. There weren't conversations about that internationally. The Nixon administration just decided almost overnight that we're going to move off and go to a full float. And in the words of the Treasury Secretary of the time, it's our currency, it's your problem, because the alternative for everyone else was worse, still is today. I mean, leaving aside the idea that the dollar is going away is silly. Let's say the dollar did break as the reserve currency overnight. Let's just say that happened. Then we're a normal currency. And we're still the currency for the U.S. domestic economy. And roughly 90% of the U.S. economy is held within the United States, and another 5% is held within Mexico and Canada. So you only really have 5% exposure to the wider world. As for all of the debt, yes, a large portion of that is held abroad, but the U.S. still has control over its own money supply, and that debt is already out there. And every once in a while, there's this delightful conversation between some wackadoo Chinese ideologue and the U.S. Fed in St. Louis, where the wackadoo ideologue says, if we really want to stick to the United States, we're just going to dump all $3 trillion of our bond holdings overnight. And you always get this same snarky response from the St. Louis Fed that says something like, well, that would be really interesting because the debt would probably trade at 30 cents on the dollar very, very quickly. But I don't know if you knew this, China, but the U.S. Federal Reserve controls the U.S. money supply. And it's mostly digital now. So we would just click a couple buttons and expand the money supply by the exact number of that 3 trillion, discounted 70%, and retire the whole thing. You would save us over $2 trillion in an hour. And you would be out over $2 trillion in an hour. That would be brilliant. Please do that. And then we never hear from that ideologue again because he's brought shame to China for being so stupid. So no, even in the worst case scenario where Martian currency takes over, the U.S. is still a normal currency for U.S. purposes. Now, there is a cost in that scenario. That would probably force our political leaders to be a little bit more judicious with their spending in the long run, because we wouldn't be able to just dump our debt on everyone else's system. That's probably the real superpower. It allows us to not be fiscally responsible. But beyond that, which I would argue it gives us the ability to inject ourselves into any economic exchange. And I don't mean to minimize how useful that can be. That's one of the reasons why the sanctions on Iran have been so effective, and even relatively light sanctions in comparison on Russia have been effective. Because if Brazil and China are going to do a traditional exchange, the Chinese exchange yuan for dollars, and then the dollars are exchanged for reals, or going back the other direction. And that allows the United States to interrupt any exchange, should it choose so. Now, the Fed is not staffed to monitor global monetary exchanges, so we don't do that unless there's a specific sanctions regime in place. But we have the option. And in a world of demographic decline and geopolitical upheaval, options are good. Crypto, it really depends on which crypto asset, but let's just use Bitcoin because most people are familiar with that one. It's a little bit more sophisticated. They print currency out of thin air, and then they get someone to buy it from them. There's a second step there that's basically a pyramid scheme.
And I know we didn't talk about this here during the discussion, but it feels like there was a whole period of time where people were saying that those digital currencies were going to be the ones that superseded the U.S. dollar for that exact reason, because they're like, well, the U.S. just prints money. Why can't we just print money?
I would argue that's not a great reason.
What do you make of him saying that? That, well, they print money out of thin air. People say the government does too, and maybe we do, but we're the government.
Well, the government is also responsible for regulating a $23 trillion economic system and managing roughly $25 trillion in global trade. So the scale and the reach and the active management that is required to do that also requires a monetary authority that can expand and shrink the monetary supply as is necessary. One of the many things that the crypto bros miss is that the money supply is not a one-directional thing. And if the entire money supply is held by private interests, who has to give it up when it's time to go the other direction? And who decides who has to give it up? The thing that would help the most is building out processing capacity for any and all of the materials that are going to be necessary as we lose Russian and Chinese supplies. The Inflation Reduction Act, which is a stupid name for what it actually does, is actually our first step in that direction since the 1940s. And so it's inefficient and it's overly expensive and it's sloppy. But for the first time we've done it, it's not bad. Oh, I'm not a financial guy, so let me just kind of give you the headline.
Yeah.
We're entering a world of capital shortage. The baby boomers are retiring globally. They're taking all their money with them. The next generation down, no matter where you are, no matter what country you're in, is smaller. So if capital is more expensive, it is going to be able to demand higher returns. So if you can hold on through this transition, we're going to go back to a world like we had in the 1980s, where your financial planner actually had to do work. Couldn't just throw money at these artificial, maybe AI-generated trading platforms or do high-frequency trading. It's going to be about the value. And honestly, I think we're about better set up for that even today. So if you do have capital, all you have to do is wait a couple of years and the market will take care of you. Well, all of those would be shocking events that I had not forecast. I don't think any of those are very likely. I'm trying to come up with something that might actually has a slight chance of actually happening. I could see France leaving the European Union.
Wow. Okay. We'll talk again. So
for them, it was always a political project, not an economic one. And clearly it's now starting to cause some economic pain. I like to figure out how things work, why things work, and where that takes us. And I like to do it while I'm backpacking. So I need to get to a place where the world can't reach me. I spend at least 2 weeks backpacking every summer. I'm going to try to make that 6 this summer. Tour?
Yeah, backpacking tour. When you were backpacking.
Oh, well, that's easy. I mean, it's been a long time, but a place called Cascade Saddle in New Zealand. It has alpenglow, it has morning rainbows, and you are a vertical 1.5 kilometers directly above the valley floor. It's a straight drop down. Now, it's I've freed up a little bit of time, so I am noodling over some ideas, but I'm not there yet. Everything is most easily accessible through the website, which is zeihan.com. That's where you can sign up for the newsletter. That's where you can sign up for the video log, and that's where all of the information about all of the books are.